The first time I realized my neighborhood had decided I was the problem. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at an email sent to 280 homes with my name written between the lines. It did not say my name directly, but everyone knew exactly who it was about. The subject line read, "Community Image Concern," and inside, the president of our homeowners association had basically told my neighbors that someone on Willow Creek Lane was living off taxpayer support and dragging down the reputation of our community. That someone was me. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 37 years old when this happened. A civil rights attorney who spent most of my career helping other people fight unfair treatment, and somehow I found myself sitting on the other side of the courtroom fence, wondering how quickly a group of people could decide they knew my entire life from one piece of private information. 4 months earlier, I had moved into Briarwood Heights, a quiet neighborhood outside Asheville, North Carolina, with 280 beautiful homes, old oak trees lining the streets, perfectly trimmed lawns, and a clubhouse that looked like it had been designed specifically to make people feel important. From the outside, it was the kind of place people dreamed about moving into. White fences, brick walkways, holiday decorations timed perfectly with the seasons, neighbors waving politely as they drove by. But before I even unpacked the last box, I started hearing stories about the person who controlled the neighborhood rules. Her name was Linda Carver, the HOA president. Linda was 50 years old, always perfectly dressed, always carrying a folder full of printed regulations, and she had a talent for making every conversation sound like a formal hearing. She was the kind of person who could compliment your flowers while reminding you that they were 3 inches too close to the sidewalk. Before I moved in, I received several messages from residents warning me about her. They told me she had a habit of finding small violations, especially with people who disagreed with her. At first, I honestly thought they were exaggerating. I had worked with discrimination cases for years. I knew emotions could make people see situations differently. I wanted to believe Linda was just strict, maybe overly passionate about keeping the neighborhood nice. Then my divorce happened. Like many people going through a major life change, I had to rebuild things piece by piece. I was raising 2 children, restarting my law practice, and trying to keep everything stable while I figured out what came next. For a short period, I applied for assistance programs that existed specifically for families going through financial transitions. It was temporary, it was legal, and frankly, it was nobody else's business. But somehow, Linda found out. 3 weeks later, that email landed in every inbox in Briarwood Heights. She never mentioned me by name, but she mentioned my street, my situation, and enough details that anyone with a mailbox knew exactly who she meant. I remember reading those words over and over, feeling something I had not felt in years. Not anger at first, embarrassment. That was the part people rarely talk about. When someone attacks you publicly, the first emotion is not always rage. Sometimes it is that quiet moment where you wonder if everyone around you believes them. I looked out my window and saw neighbors who had waved to me before suddenly looking away. I saw my kids playing in the yard and wondered if they felt the tension too. Then, 5 days after the email, Linda sent me my first violation notice. The fine was $900 for failure to maintain acceptable lawn conditions. I actually laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. I grabbed my measuring tape and walked outside. My grass was 3.1 inches tall. The HOA rules clearly stated the maximum allowed height was 4 inches. I took pictures from every angle. Then came another violation, $350 for a faded mailbox finish. The strange part was that I had repainted that mailbox 6 months earlier using the exact color code listed in the HOA guidelines. At that moment, something changed inside me. I stopped seeing Linda as someone who was simply being rude. I started seeing a pattern. And as an attorney, I knew one thing better than most people. Patterns leave evidence. So I opened a folder on my computer, and I started documenting everything. Every email, every notice, every conversation. I had no idea that folder would eventually become the reason Linda Carver lost her position, her reputation, and control over the community she thought belonged to her. Because what Linda did not understand was that I was not trying to win a neighborhood argument. I was collecting proof. And over the next 4 months, that proof would reveal something much bigger than a few unfair fines. I spent the next several weeks doing something most people in my position probably would not have done. I stopped arguing. I stopped trying to convince Linda Carver that she was being unfair. Because I had learned something during my years as a civil rights attorney, When someone has convinced themselves they are right, facts rarely change their mind. Evidence does. So instead of sending angry emails, I quietly started building a timeline. Every violation notice went into a folder. Every conversation was documented. Every rule was compared with how that same rule was applied to other people in Briarwood Heights. And the more I looked, the more uncomfortable the picture became. The first thing I noticed was that my case was not unique. There were other people who had quietly been dealing with the same thing for years. People who were afraid to speak because they did not want to become the next target. The first person who contacted me was a middle school teacher named Sarah Collins. She showed up at my door one evening holding a folder that looked almost identical to mine. She laughed nervously and said, "I guess I'm not the only one collecting homework from the HOA." Inside her folder were years of notices about a basketball hoop in her driveway. The funny thing was, the basketball hoop had been there before Linda became president. Nobody cared about it until Sarah disagreed with Linda during a neighborhood meeting. Then suddenly, the hoop became a community appearance issue. After Sarah came forward, others followed. An elderly couple named Frank and Evelyn Harper had been warned about their garden decorations. They had small stone animals and handmade decorations that their grandchildren loved. Linda told them the items created a visually inconsistent environment. A nurse named Melissa Grant had received multiple warnings about holiday lights, even though several other homes had decorations that stayed up longer without any complaints. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Linda was not enforcing rules. She was choosing who deserved to have rules enforced against them. But the biggest discovery came when I started looking into HOA finances. Briarwood Heights collected thousands of dollars every year from residents for maintenance, repairs, and community improvements. Those funds belonged to everyone. They were not personal money. They were supposed to be managed with transparency. I requested public records and reviewed meeting notes, invoices, and financial reports. That was when I found the landscaping contract. 6 months earlier, Linda had approved a $31,000 payment from HOA reserve funds for a neighborhood landscaping upgrade. On paper, it sounded reasonable. The entrance would be improved. Flower beds would be redesigned. Trees would be maintained. Everyone likes a beautiful neighborhood. But then I looked closer at the contractor. The company belonged to Linda's husband, Greg Carver. There was no competitive bidding process, no discussion of other companies, no record showing residents had been given a choice. It was simply approved. The deeper I dug, the more questions appeared. I contacted a professional who helped review construction and landscaping costs. The estimate came back showing the actual wholesale value of the work was closer to $12,000. The difference was not a small accounting mistake. It was nearly $20,000. At that point, this was no longer about my lawn. It was no longer about a mailbox. This was about power, money, and whether one person had been using an entire community like her private kingdom. I remember sitting at my desk late one night, surrounded by documents, emails, and photographs. My kids were asleep upstairs. The house was completely quiet, and I looked at everything spread across that desk and thought about how strange life can be. A few months earlier, I had moved into Briarwood Heights, hoping for a fresh start after my divorce. I wanted peace. I wanted normal. Instead, I found myself preparing a legal case against the very organization that was supposed to protect the neighborhood. But I also knew something else. There were 9 families now standing with me. People who had been afraid to speak were finally telling their stories. We were not angry neighbors anymore. We were witnesses. Together, we created a detailed record of everything that had happened. Photos showing different treatment, emails showing selective enforcement, financial documents showing questionable decisions. We gathered enough information that I knew a simple complaint would not be enough. Linda had built her authority on the assumption that nobody would challenge her. She believed people would complain privately, then eventually give up. And honestly, for a long time, that strategy worked. People were tired. They had jobs. They had families. They did not want conflict. But Linda made one mistake. She picked a fight with someone whose entire career was built around uncovering unfair systems. The next step was not going to be another angry email. It was going to be accountability. I prepared a formal complaint, including a 47-page report detailing the timeline, the financial concerns, and the evidence from every resident involved. We filed complaints with the state housing authorities and began the process of legal action. When Linda received the paperwork, she reacted exactly how I expected. She called me. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the frustration underneath. "Claire, I think you are taking this way too far, she said. This neighborhood has standards. Not everyone understands the responsibility of maintaining them. I remember looking at the stack of evidence in front of me and smiling. Linda, I replied, standards only matter when they apply to everyone. There was a long silence. Then she said something I will never forget. You were making yourself very unpopular. And maybe she was right, but popularity was never the goal. Fairness was. The next few days changed everything. Linda thought she was about to silence a group of unhappy residents. She had no idea she was about to expose everything she had spent years hiding. Because once the financial records reached the right people, the question was no longer whether Linda had been unfair. The question became how long everyone had allowed it to continue. The moment everything changed was not dramatic at first. There were no reporters waiting outside the clubhouse, no neighbors screaming in the streets, no movie-style scene where everyone suddenly realized who was right and who was wrong. Real life rarely works that way. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, through documents, signatures, and people finally deciding they are tired of being afraid. The first sign that Linda Carver was losing control came from a phone call I received early one morning. It was from the attorney she had hired to defend her. His tone was professional, but different from the confidence I had heard from Linda before. He told me that after reviewing the financial records, the resident statements, the emails, and the timeline of enforcement decisions, he had decided to withdraw from representing her. He did not say much more, but he did not need to. After months of Linda acting like nothing could touch her, suddenly even her own legal team could see the weight of what was sitting in front of them. Linda had spent years believing that people would complain privately and then disappear. She thought everyone would rather accept unfair treatment than create conflict. And honestly, for a long time, she was right. Most people do not want to fight with their neighbors. They want to come home after work, spend time with their families, and live peacefully. That is exactly why people like Linda often gain so much control. They rely on silence. But silence is not the same thing as agreement. Sometimes people are quiet because they are waiting for someone to finally say, "This is not okay." 2 days after her attorney stepped away, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. I remember walking into that clubhouse and feeling how different the room was compared to just a few months earlier. The same walls that had once felt intimidating suddenly felt smaller. The same chairs where residents had sat quietly while Linda dominated every discussion were now filled with people holding copies of documents, asking questions, and demanding answers. For the first time, Linda was not the person running the meeting. She was the person answering questions. She sat there with a stack of papers in front of her, trying to explain why certain residents had received violations while others had not. She tried to explain why her husband's company received the landscaping contract without competitive bids. She tried to explain why a project listed at $31,000 appeared to have cost significantly less than that amount in actual materials and labor. But explanations are difficult when the records tell a different story. One resident stood up and said something that I will never forget. It was Frank Harper, the elderly man who had been warned about his garden decorations. He looked at Linda and said, "For years, we thought you were protecting this neighborhood. We did not realize you were protecting yourself." The room went silent. Linda looked around, probably expecting someone to defend her. Nobody did. Then the vote began. One by one, the board members cast their decisions. 6 votes, 6 members, 6 voices saying the same thing. Linda Carver was removed as HOA president immediately. Her access to financial accounts was frozen, and an independent review of the association's finances was ordered. Watching that happen was strange because I did not feel the satisfaction I expected. I thought I would feel anger leaving my body. I thought I would feel like I had won. Instead, I felt tired. I felt relief. Because this was never about destroying Linda. It was about stopping a system that allowed one person's personal opinions to become everyone else's punishment. Several weeks later, the settlement was finalized. Linda was required to repay the funds connected to the improper landscaping arrangement, and the HOA insurance policy provided compensation to the residents who had been harmed by the pattern of unfair enforcement. The total settlement helped many families recover from years of stress and financial pressure. But honestly, the money was never the part that mattered most to me. Money can repair a bank account. It cannot repair the feeling of being publicly humiliated. It cannot erase the moment someone tells an entire neighborhood that you are somehow less deserving because your life became difficult. What mattered was that people finally understood what happened. They understood that needing temporary help did not make someone a bad neighbor. They understood that a person's financial situation did not determine their worth, and they understood that community rules only work when they are applied with fairness. The investigation into Linda and Greg's financial decisions continued afterward. They were permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership position, and the landscaping company connected to the contract was removed from future consideration. When the next HOA election arrived, I honestly expected someone else to step forward. I never wanted to spend my life attending meetings and reviewing budgets. I had a law practice. I had children. I had enough responsibilities already, but several neighbors approached me and said something that changed my mind. They told me they did not need someone who wanted power. They needed someone who understood what it felt like to have no power at all. So I agreed. When the votes were counted, I was elected to the board with overwhelming support. My first goal was simple: make sure the HOA could never again be used as a personal weapon. We removed the enforcement committee Linda had created, changed the review process for violations, required financial transparency, and made sure every resident had a chance to challenge decisions before penalties were issued. Slowly, the neighborhood started changing. Not the way people usually imagine. The houses did not suddenly become different. The streets did not magically transform. The biggest change was invisible. People started trusting each other again. Neighbors who had avoided meetings began showing up. Residents who had been afraid to ask questions started speaking. People stopped assuming that the person holding the title automatically deserved respect. They started asking for accountability. Looking back, I still think about that first email. The one that was supposed to embarrass me. The one that was supposed to make me feel small. Linda thought she was exposing my weakness. Instead, she exposed her own. She showed everyone what happens when someone cares more about appearances than people. She reminded us that a perfect-looking neighborhood can still have serious problems behind closed doors. And maybe the biggest lesson I learned is that communities are not built by perfectly maintained lawns, expensive landscaping, or strict rulebooks. Communities are built by how people treat each other when someone is struggling. Anyone can be kind when life is easy. The real test comes when someone needs understanding. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever lived somewhere where rules were used more to control people than to protect them? Do you think HOA leaders sometimes cross the line between maintaining standards and abusing authority? Or do you believe communities need stronger enforcement to stay organized? Share your thoughts in the comments because I know this topic brings out strong opinions on both sides. And if you have ever felt like your voice did not matter, remember this story. One person documenting the truth can change an entire system. If you believe fairness matters, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the person everyone tries to silence is the person who ends up speaking for everyone.